I had a remarkable experience last week, unlike anything I have ever encountered. It was positive, and I hope I never have to repeat it. On each morning of Rosh Hashanah, I completed my own tefillot together with the early parking lot minyan, and then I made the rounds of the other tefillah locations that our shul convened. I stopped by the JCC gym, sunlight filtered through the windows into a familiar room that had been transformed into a prayer space where 40 members of our community could daven and hear Torah reading and shofar. I went into our main shul where our shul office had assigned each of 50 worshipers to his or her own distanced seat. Even though 50 occupied seats in a room that can fit 600 leaves many empty seats, they were spaced out in such a way that for the first time in 6 months, the shul looked somewhat full, which is how it should look. I then circled the block and came to a townhouse backyard that had been transformed into a bucolic outdoor shul. I then returned to our shul, where the second parking lot minyan was well underway, and heard a second chazan and congregation chanting the prayers I had recited just an hour earlier. It was a beautiful and inspiring morning. I wish there had been some way to record how our community's prayers burst forth from the walls of our shul and filled adjacent spaces for hour after hour on Rosh Hashanah morning. I imagine the prayers from all of these micro-congregations and the sounds of the shofar blast from each of these gatherings mingling on their way up to heaven. I loved seeing all of these different minyanim spread out across our neighborhood. But then I thought about everyone else, whose prayers were invisible to me, whose voices did I not hear. I had no way to see those of you who stayed home on Rosh Hashanah, and I have no way to see those of you who will be home on Yom Kippur out of concern for your health. And I had no way to listen to the prayers that we had to omit on Rosh Hashanah, and I have no way to listen to the prayers we will omit on Yom Kippur in order to accommodate our unique circumstances. Those of you who have not been in shul in deference to medical advice are my heroes. And so too are those of you who have kept returning this summer to our distanced and minimized shul, despite the absence of many of the elements that made shul compelling for you in the past. This is the best of times and the worst of times for our ability to pray and our capacity to pray and our access to prayer. The worst of times is obvious and does not need to be repeated, but I want to share with you why I think ultimately this can be the best of times as well. The Torah says that we should serve God with all of our hearts. How can one serve God with our hearts, the Talmudic rabbis asked, other than through prayer? Rambam Maimonides takes this rabbinic tradition at face value and claims that there is a biblical obligation, mitzvat aseh min haTorah, to pray each day. In his understanding, the Talmudic rabbis then codified and defined that obligation, and the result are the word that we find in the Sidurim and the Machzorim that we use today. Ramban Nachmanides disagreed. The biblical model of prayer is entirely spontaneous. That is, almost exclusively the form of prayer that we find in Scripture. Instead, he wrote, the Torah only commands us to pray under very specific circumstances. V'chitavo milchama ba'artzachem al atzar tzorer etzechem v'arotem b'chatzotzrot v'niskartem v'fnei Hashem Elokeichem v'noshatem mi'oivechem. In Numbers chapter 10, the Torah says that we should blow trua blasts as we go to battle against our enemies, and in this way, God shall remember us and we will be saved. V'niskartem v'fnei Hashem Elokeichem v'noshatem. Ramban extrapolates from this verse and concludes that in times of distress, a foreign enemy or any other danger, there is an obligation to turn to God in prayer. The mitzvah that we perform with the Siddur routinely 3 times each day is an entirely rabbinic mitzvah, according to Ramban. There's a substantial body of literature analyzing the positions of Rambam and Ramban and the proof that supports each of their positions and the evidence that undermines each of their positions. I doubt you will be surprised to learn that there is compelling evidence on both sides. But in the last generation, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik attempted to reconcile the two positions. Fundamentally, he asserted, there is no dispute whatsoever between Rambam and Ramban. Prayer is only a biblical obligation at a time of distress, as Ramban and all of his evidence support. But Rambam understood that to be a human being means to experience distress. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs's reformulation, prayer is a sustained tutorial in emotional literacy. It is a way of learning how to feel as a Jew living within the world. In Yiddish they say, schwer zu sein a Yid, it's hard to be a Jew. Well, it's also hard to be a human being. Schwer zu sein a Mensch. This was always true, but we don't need to be reminded this year. Never before in my life has planning our family Shabbos menu had to take into account the personal risk I would take on by an extra trip to the supermarket. There are members of our community who have not had a steady and reliable source of income in 6 months. There are members of our community who will be forced to give up their jobs and their reliable source of income if schools cannot stay open for in-person instruction. And there are teachers in our community who fear being with our children for in-person instruction. There are members of our community who have pre-existing conditions that place them at extremely high risk for COVID. And there are members of our community at relatively low personal risk, but who are the sole caregivers for aging parents. Being a human being always entails risk. This is an unavoidable element of even the most blessed and privileged life. The rabbinic obligation to recite Shachrit and Mincha and Marav each day fulfills a biblical mandate to turn to God for solace from the depths of that distress. The very words that we say are asking God for things that we need, are de facto acknowledgments that we have needs. We have needs for health, for food and shelter, and also for redemption, for a world of justice and peace. And those needs cannot be met entirely through our own agency. Rabbi Soloveitchik, teaching and writing in the 1960s, returned again and again to remind his audience of the fundamental vulnerability of human existence because he feared that his audience would forget. We can't forget. When we feel distress, our obligation is certainly a mitzvah d'oraita, a Torah-level mitzvah, which is an obligation, but also an opportunity. We each have personal fears and anxieties, and were we to share each and every one of them together in some public forum, I'm convinced that we share many of them in common. But I also have worries as someone with a leadership position in this congregation. There's been a lot of angst among rabbis and among the synagogue leadership of all of the North American Jewish denominations surrounding the question of whether or not Jews will return to the synagogue when it becomes safe to do so in large numbers and crowded together as before. I understand why that angst exists, and as I've said, I share it too. But I think it's a secondary question. Public prayer and shuls are a means to an end, and that end is the ability of a human being to learn how to feel as a Jew in the world and to connect to other Jews trying to learn that same thing. We can do this on our own for the time being if we remember to pray. It is so hard to acknowledge that threats exist which we cannot defeat on our own, but it's so rewarding to know that the Torah views this distress as an invitation to turn towards God. So in the world of prayer, it's been the best of times and the worst of times. It's been the worst of times for having access to the building that housed our prayers and having recourse to the rousing melodies that stirred our souls for years and years. But God is never limited by a building, and access to God is not dependent on any group activity. No matter where you find yourself on Yom Kippur and in the weeks that follow, daven as though you've never davened before. In 1942, Moshe Barachovitz found himself in a bunker outside the Polish village of Zelachov, where his wife and children and sisters and their children had been murdered. He alone from his family survived. He alone survived from all the Jews of Zelachov, and as far as Moshe Barachovitz knew, he was the only Jew left in the world. Just as the shuls and Batei Medrash of Zelachav had been destroyed, Moshe Bar Chavitz destroyed that all the shuls and all the Svarim, all the Torah scrolls and the holy books in the world had been destroyed. What did he do in that bunker? He wrote a Siddur. The world could not exist without a Siddur. And so day by day, he wrote out by hand, using the same calligraphy used to write Torah scrolls. Moshe Bar Chavitz wrote a Siddur. But he did not only write out the words of the Siddur by heart in that bunker. He also wrote the names of his martyred family and neighbors in between the prayers and even in the midst of the prayers. Ashrei Yoshevei Veitecha Shmuel ben Yosef. Od Yalucha Sela Rivka, but Moshe David. Moshe and his Siddur survived the war, and the Siddur is on display at the Ghetto Fighters Museum in Israel. We have not suffered in the ways that our grandparents' generation suffered, but their example can give us courage and give us grit and inspiration to rise to the lesser but very real challenges that we do face. In deep and tragic isolation, Moshe Bar Chavitz knew that the world needed prayer, and when forced to pray alone, he brought his family and his community with him in prayer. Many of us will be forced to pray alone this Yom Kippur, and all of us who attend in-person minyan will be forced to pray on Yom Kippur without some beloved piyutim and prayers that we are going to omit in our congregation and most congregations in the name of time and in the name of safety. Weave the missed prayers back into your day. As you care for your children, say their Hebrew names, treat them with compassion in prayerful hopes that God will treat us as an Av HaRachamim, as a compassionate parent. As you walk home from a distanced and shortened tefillah, sing the words of Haderet V'Amunah or some other prayer that we're not going to say together this year. I look forward to seeing many of you in person over the course of Yom Kippur. I look forward with even greater anticipation to seeing all of you in person under happy and healthy circumstances as soon as that becomes safe, please God, in 5781. But until then, daven well. Whether you spend the entire day huddled over the machzor or only say a few prayers in between feeding children and other parenting responsibilities, daven well. V'niskartem b'fnei Hashem Elokechem v'noshatem. May we all be remembered before the Lord our God and be saved. I wish you all Gemar Chesima Tova.